Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Out of Spec podcast, where we are absolutely charged up about all things electric. I am your host, Francie, and today we are diving deep into the world of electric vehicles, of course, and that of fleet electrification with our special guest, Taylor Steele. And Taylor is no stranger to the EV industry with over a decade of experience in energy infrastructure, which is amazing. I'm so excited to have you on. You worked at Tesla and also were director of renewables at Seam Group. And you've had a hand in and a first row seat to the developments in the EV charging solutions and commercial fleet electrification. So today we are going to be learning not only about you, but asking the questions on our mind about fleet electrification and public charging and energy and more. So let's plug in. This episode is made possible by the support we get from Fort Collins Kia. If you are in the market for any electric Kia, not only do they never add market adjustments, they will deliver your car to you anywhere in the 48 contiguous states for out-of-spec viewers. More information in the link in the show notes. Of course, Taylor, it's fantastic to have you on the show. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and your journey in the EV industry? I absolutely love knowing how people got involved. I know that my path was a little bit windy to what brought me here, but some folks just have a straightaway approach. And I'd love to know yours.
It's kind of a really funny story, actually. So, I would say the last 10 years of my career have been pretty linear, but I actually went to undergrad as a vocal performance major, like sang in choir and wanted to go pursue opera and all that sort of stuff. And once I decided that was not the career path for me, I traveled around a bit and explored university. And I was lucky enough to go to Central Washington University, who had an alternative energies minor program. And so I ended up getting a minor in alternative energies. That's really what kicked me off in deciding and very clearly from that age saying, energy is the space that I want to be in. This is something I'm really passionate about. I started in utility scale solar, so working on project management for kind of 20 megawatt solar projects about 10 years ago, virtual PPAs kind of all over. And I was young and super impatient. And so I ended up going to Tesla and getting a very similar job, but for EV charging infrastructure, which frankly, I didn't know much about. I wasn't particularly passionate about charging people's cars, but it seemed like skill that I had at a company that was really exciting. So then I spent 6 years at Tesla cutting my teeth on the supercharger network, both in Southern California and in the UK, and then ultimately went to Seam. So I somehow in that journey actually ended up falling in love with charging and the electrification space, and have been kind of on both sides, like the load side and the generation side. And I find it really fascinating to think about how we interact with energy, and how we can be more efficient and more effective with something that has become a very vital resource.
I absolutely love that. You went from kind of a drama background, right, with the opera, gotta love that, to an industry that has its own dramatic, dynamic, complicated changes from regulation to what's happening in the companies. And I love that storyline because you kind of are like, yeah, let me dip my toes in this. This is tied to our world so deeply from energy and transportation that personally, I find it so interesting to see what we're doing with all of this. And then you to have this background. Yeah, I can't imagine all the wonderful perspective you now have, having worked on different sides of the industry, because it's so intersectional. There's so many different parties that are very invested in the advancements and the innovation and in the projects that are going on. So, okay, amazing. Can't wait to learn more about your expertise and your insight into this, because fleet electrification, I feel like your perspective here is so valuable because it's not only there's regulation pushing for it, but there are leaders that are pushing for it. There's cost-effective savings. We're going electric. So how are you going to do it? And more companies are looking to make the switch, but I'm sure they don't know exactly where to start. I've been to conferences where that's the whole point of an hour-long conversation is this is our case study of what we've done, so we can share it to see if you can learn something from it. So I understand you're transitioning to a new role, but can you share some insights into the transition to electric, specifically in the commercial space, we talk a lot about passenger vehicles here. And who are the type of customers looking to transition their fleets or electrify, their big commercial workings in 2024?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of players, and I think there's a few different motivations. We talked a little bit about regulation. I think regulation is a big push as you look to some of the regulations in California that are passing or likely to pass, and all of that, and other states that are adopting similar aspects. If you start to look at some of the proposals and policies at the federal level, you really see this push specific to fleets and trucks, which is new and really exciting. I also think it creates a bit of a challenge. And so the motivation, or quite frankly, soapbox that I've been on for a little while, is that there are these fleet owners getting specific, particularly about last mile distribution, local and regional transportation, ports and drayage vehicles. That's where I really think the bulk of the frenzy is at right now. I don't know that we're quite at long haul, although some would argue that that's coming too very quickly. So we look at these folks and they're like, okay, we're ready to electrify. There's a use case here, right? We maybe have a sub 150-mile route that could electrify theoretically quite simply. We're being pushed to do that from regulation. And you also have, on the other side of the fence, a bunch of players from the passenger EV charging space who kind of know how to electrify. It's very complicated, right? You've got to get permitting agencies involved. You've got to get utilities and upgrades and powers, and there's a billion OEMs, and how do you pick the right charging hardware, and does it work with your truck? Like all of these questions. And there's a bunch of people that know the answer to that question and know nothing about fleets and how logistics work. And quite frankly, fleets are incredibly efficient systems that for a very long time, logistics have been improved and improved and improved. And so you can't take a last mile vehicle delivery a mile off route for an hour to charge it. And so how do you start solving those problems? And I guess that's a roundabout way to say, I think local regional distribution, last mile drayage is very exciting, and bridging the gap between electrification experts and logistics experts together are going to be the ones to solve that problem.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, I think about how the United States Postal Service is electrifying a lot of their fleet, and that's a really, well, I mean, maybe some people would argue, but it's a really efficient system that everyone, I know they had some trouble during COVID, but the delivery fleets, we've seen a lot of action there. And this is kind of new. And you worked Tesla's, superchargers and the public EV infrastructure side of things. With all that, what we've learned, although it is distinct from the needs of fleet electrification, do you think that the fleet electrification side of things, that these folks are taking the lessons learned from the public side and running with it? Or are there so many differences where it kind of has to, we can take that experience, but we really have to cater it to this new need?
Oh, that's a great question. And I think the answer is frankly kind of the last part, right? Which is like, we can take this experience. It is a new need and it is different. What I see is like, I don't know if that transition and transfer of knowledge is happening particularly effectively. I've been to a number of conferences or in a lot of rooms where we just can't seem to get all the right players in the room at the same time. So maybe you go to a fleet conference and you have a lot of fleet operators, but the utilities aren't there. And you go to a utility conference and the fleet operators aren't there. Or you go to a charging expo, but the fleet operators. So how do we get to a point where we're all in that same room, knowledge sharing? Because I do think there are a lot of really important lessons learned from the passenger vehicle charging side that we've seen over a lot of years that can absolutely be applied. But I don't know that it's quite happening yet.
I don't think you're the only one that I've heard, or I know you're not the only one that I've heard echo a similar kind of sentiment, which is we have to have everyone talking to each other, because everyone's has kind of been assigned a role and working with a role, but there's questions of, is this really the role that they should play? How should they be in the conversation? Which kind of decisions should they be making? And maybe that should be different because, of course, new industry, we're figuring everything out. It's okay to embrace some change, but especially with utilities. So I have also worked on the public side of things. Utilities, in terms of EV charging, utilities are essential, and they are very much a huge just decider and determiner of how quickly a site gets set up. If a site gets set up, they make a lot of decisions. And I wonder about your impression of the roles that we have. I mean, do you agree that we've been doing it exactly right, that the decision makers that we have should be the decision makers, or should there perhaps be an embracing of different restructuring when it comes to electrifying not only public but the private side of things?
Yeah, I think there should be, whether it's a restructuring, maybe a restructure. I think we need to be open. We need to be open to challenging the ways in which we've worked historically and how we can most efficiently and effectively facilitate this transition. I personally believe that all the regulation and all the signs and even the adoption is pointing to we're going down this path. So let's all kind of do it together. As it's specific to utilities, one of the things that was really impactful for me and how we approach some things at Tesla. One of my former leaders and a great friend and mentor of mine really changed our perspective a bit, because it's very easy as a public charging operator to go to a utility and ask for X amount of power and then say no, it's going to take 5 years, and then we get upset and we're very frustrated with the utility. And this particular leader was like, look, we're married to the utility. We have to play nice. There's no other opportunity here. And I think that allowed us and enabled us to maybe a bit aggressively go really spend time in their office trying to understand what they needed from us, what we needed from them, and how we could kind of partner and get things done. And we've made really great headway with folks like SCE and PG&E, but there's a ton of other IOUs and municipalities where we've got to do the same thing. I was in a conference recently, a bit of a smaller kind of working group, which was really nice. And there were some utility folks there. And one of the things I noticed is that utilities were saying, well, we need the data. And people who want to electrify fleets or are buying trucks aren't giving us the data. We don't know where they're going. And I kind of said and challenged them, as someone who's worked in charging for years, we're trying to give you data. We want to have conversations. We want to know where the open circuits are going. And so there's a misalignment here. And I don't know if it's, we don't have the right people from the utilities in the right spaces or whatever, but to your point, do we need to restructure what that looks like? Possibly. There should be a process where someone is responsible for understanding these forecasts of electrification. And I think that's one thing that's getting missed through the cracks.
I can imagine how complicated it is, and weighing the different interests from the different stakeholders and their different backgrounds and how things work. And I know, utilities is a pretty, traditional space. They've been doing things a certain way for a long time. And now with the introduction of a lot more wants and needs from going electric, as you're saying, which is happening, I feel like it is really complicated. So I like that insight into, yeah, we're married to them. We got to work with the systems and the people that are there that are essential to the process. And then how can we kind of, better host the conversation to include everyone and represent everyone. And I love how we just immediately dove into the weeds of utilities, because energy is such a key part of it. And when I'm thinking about energy, of course, you worked in renewables. There's a lot of impact to be made from energy, and energy has a huge impact on our lives. And of course, if I want to electrify a fleet, I probably want to have some behind the fence solution. So anyways, those are a lot of things that come to my mind, but I also want to talk about the implications for the largest impacts and the greatest potential for impactful electrification of fleets. Not only is it environmental, but there's also huge economic benefits that, of course, are being weighed here. So can you maybe give me some insight into of course, there's environmental benefits, and I feel like that comes into the regulation a lot of the time. But if you're a business, you're thinking of the economic benefits, how those are balanced and considered in the world that you've seen.
Yeah, it's a complicated math problem, and quite frankly, I don't know that anyone's really figured out how to look at it on a clear balance sheet. But ultimately, what we're seeing, especially now that we've had vehicles that have been on the road for 10 plus years, that have been on the road for over, there's many battery packs out there with over 400,000 miles on them, where you have to start thinking about these challenges is, okay, the capex of a new electric fleet might be a little bit more of an investment than just continuing to buy ICE vehicles. However, the reduced cost in maintenance is significantly lower at this point, or those vehicles might run a lot longer. Your fueling costs are going to be down pretty low, not only from a baseline, right? We just baseline know electricity is cheaper, but then you start thinking about how can we start playing with optimized operations, diversified load, and really managing those logistics operations. And that's what I think is going to unlock the next bit of efficiency there. Then, of course, you have regulations, you have incentive programs, you have grant programs, and you could say that those are temporary, but it does help us start that transition over. So I think folks really have to sit down and start looking at the math problem. One of the things that is challenging, not just in the finances of fleet electrification in general, but I think in most things, is that we're still in such a nascent part of the industry that everything is a site specific or fleet specific problem. You've got to sit down and you've got to really think about it. And one of the things that I'm working really diligently on, especially with my new stealth mode startup that I'm in here, is how do you make these equations effectively scalable and make them apply to a lot of different use cases, and say, okay, generally, if you have a fleet of this size that's running this type of operation, this is probably your best bet as a solution from a framework, right? And the specifics we can go into, and that keeps us from having to kind of start at square one every single time someone wants 10 electric trucks.
That is such a good point, that it is really case by case, depending on where you are, what kind of work you're doing, if you're medium versus heavy duty, which I want to get into as well. But I would love you to go into the framework a little bit more. What are the considerations? Because of course, if we're kind of like outsourcing to these logistics folks who can really help us plan it, what am I forgetting? What am I not considering? Or what do I need to consider? And how do I need to consider it in that framework?
Yeah. So first and foremost is you've got to consider your operations. And I think most folks are pretty good at that, right? Like how far is a truck running in a day? How much is that stopping? One thing like we think about like last mile that's a really interesting conversation is it's a lot of stop and go, right? So you have more regen opportunity, right? So your likelihood that you're going to get more out of that battery is pretty high, which is great, right? So thinking about your operations, is it stop go traffic? Is it long haul? How many miles does that have in a day? What's your downtime and your dwell time to charge? We've seen really great examples of folks being able to optimize operations and kind of run 2 sets of trucks off a single charging site in 2 shifts, right? Like really fascinating solutions that happen. So you have to think about that. One thing people don't think about a lot is, where do you put other vehicles? So your space is really critical. Power, as we talked about, really critical. Do you want to charge on site? Do you want to charge en route? These are different things that I don't know that folks are always necessarily considering. One thing we also don't talk about is having a really great conversation with someone recently was, what is your driver experience, right? And a lot of the success of this, I think Amazon does this really well, right? Is understanding that the driver and that end user of the vehicle is crucial to these operations working. And so are we educating fleet managers, drivers, all of the above on what this adoption process looks like, is super critical. I feel like I'm now going on on a whole tangent about a long list of considerations. The one other one that I'll mention that we haven't quite gotten to yet, but I think is really critical, and actually an opportunity where fleets in some ways are ahead of where public charging infrastructure was, is interoperability. That's a really big one. If I'm a fleet owner, I guess I'm being hypothetical because I've never owned a fleet. So any fleet owners out there that disagree with this, I'm so sorry. But if I'm a fleet owner, I want maximum flexibility. Maybe I want a Ford ProMaster, but maybe the next year I want to try a different vehicle and I want to try a Workhorse or a new or whatever that looks like. I want flexibility to be able to procure anything. And that's very easy with an ICE fleet because they all use the same fuel. And that's also true with electric. However, Yes, we have a standard connector for fleet, which is great, and trucking, medium heavy duty. That's we now have that for passenger vehicle, but that was real hard for a few years for us.
Hmm.
So now we have a standard connector, but who's responsible for interoperability? In the United States, we don't have an answer for that. There's no regulation, there's no governing body. So does the charging manufacturer need to say, we've tested this equipment, it works with all of these trucks? Or does the truck need to say, we've tested all of these chargers, it works with these trucks? And that's like an interesting spot where we're both ahead and behind in fleet.
Huh. Very interesting. Yeah, when it comes to standardization, we've talked about it so much. SAE J3400, the North American Charging Standard, the Tesla connector, how that was finally kind of been decided on. Who knows? I mean, we've heard a little bit of like, what's going on with the supercharger, layoffs and stuff, but hopefully things just carry on with using the great technology, the reliable technology, but it's a whole different can of worms, but maybe not even it was settled far beforehand with the medium and heavy duty standards, which what even is like, can you give me a picture of like how much of the fleet, a commercial fleet's whole general picture in the US is electrified at this point?
Oh, like
I'm
one
sure
percent,
it's small.
less than
Okay.
1%. Yeah, we're babies. We're like very nascent. Yeah, which is really fascinating. I was reading, and I should know my stats before I come into things like this, but it's like a multi-billion dollar industry, like $32 billion or something in commercial transportation. And I'm just like, wow, like the opportunity here over the next number of years, to call this a recruiting ad. Anyone who wants to get into commercial electrification, I think it's going to be a very fun ride. So you need a career.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tiny percentage with, like you're saying, a whole lot of potential that I can't wait to see, and a whole lot of potential for impact, not only on pocketbooks, but also just advancing the technology, advancing our world, and also like, yeah, environmental impact. Transportation is one of the leading causes. And okay, I mean, I just see so much potential too. So it's crazy to think that it's such a small percentage and we're learning all about it right now. So, interop, of course, is something to consider, and whether you're charging on the road, but also or behind the scenes. And can you give me a picture as well? The difference between maybe the use cases, the needs for a medium duty fleet versus a heavy duty fleet, and yeah, paint the picture there because I would love to know the differences because I kind of, I shouldn't, but I'm like, okay, lumping them together, the bigger trucks, like the bigger delivery vans versus the passenger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, you're going to have a little bit more flexibility with medium duty, right? In that you have a lower payload. Like payload is a huge consideration. You start talking about quite a lot of weight when you're in heavy duty trucking. And so it's, pretty easy when you're in like the class 4 realm to understand like there's really only so much weight you can put on this vehicle. And so you can trust that the chassis is going to be able to handle that. Whereas if you get into heavy duty, I think how we're going to have to build confidence in this chassis is rated for this payload, and that's going to impact your range or your battery life. So I think that's a pretty big one is thinking about payload. There's of course thinking about your operations, right? When you are running a 100-mile route with a medium duty vehicle on a daily basis, it's very easy to get a vehicle where you've got a fair bit of headroom on your range, whereas you're going to get much closer to the end of your range in heavy duty, just where the technology is at. Of course, I'm a charging nerd, so you have to think about charging all the time, right? How long is that vehicle sitting? L2 versus DC fast charging. When you get into heavy duty vehicle charging, I mean, we're starting to talk about 1 megawatt charging. That's insane. That is a lot of power. And for folks, I know that you have an incredibly educated and kind of well-versed in EV space audience. But for folks like when I'm talking to my dad about power, which is often, and he's an electrical engineer, but he still doesn't know like about charging infrastructure. Or so when I'm talking about power to anyone else, right? I have to remind them like a 24 stall supercharger is pulling as much power as like a small mall. Like it's a ton of power in 24 stalls. So when we think about megawatt charging, again, we get back to like the utilities and like where's all this power going to come from? So I think that's a huge one as well. And so if you have, oh, now we're, oh, whole other line of thought, right, with this like the this idea of equity within charging, right? But if you have space and a lot of capital, you might be able to build your own substation and build megawatt charging for your trucking infrastructure. If you are a small distribution company, that is out of the realms of your means, right? And so then we start thinking about the use case of public fleet depot charging. And that looks like a bunch of different brands too.
Yes. Okay. A huge different consideration of not only the what your trucks are doing and their charging needs and the behaviors that you have versus what's what's going to be possible if you go electric. So it kind of sounds to me, if we're at 1%, when we climb to 2%, maybe it's more likely that it would be adopted in the medium duty fleets.
I think that's where we're going to see most headway over the next few years. And I also think really that's where we're going to see most diversification of what is possible, right? When you look at medium duty fleets, you've got more of them, you've got small ones, you've got large ones. You can do off-prem or on-prem, both off-premises, on-premises pretty easily. I think what we'll see in the heavy duty space is more behind the gate, very operation specific, and in such it'll also be pretty quiet, right? The PepsiCos of the world are kind of going to do their own thing and try to figure it out on their own, and then we'll kind of learn from case studies. Whereas I think on the medium duty side, what you'll have is a lot more public opportunity. We'll get to kind of see what's going on and what's working. This case study versus we're doing this all behind the scenes and it's working in this great way, like Amazon and their L2s for last mile, versus the many charging as a service providers out there that are providing depot options where we can start to see, does a multi-tenant single site solution work, which is really fascinating. And then I think that even ranges some ideas I've had with some conversations I've had with folks who have great ideas is like, what if there's a world where there's multi-tenants of multi-use cases? So do you have a site where there's 5 to 10 passenger vehicle chargers, there's 5 to 10 medium duty tenants that have reserved that site, there's a taxi fleet section, there's a UPS section, like what does that look like?
Yeah, like is it reserved stalls? What are the agreements like? I would love to touch on that a little bit more because you kind of referenced Amazon, which I think would be, primary tenant setting up their whole infrastructure behind the fence to work with their delivery fleets versus this multi-tenant scenario. So, I mean, I can imagine the differences that are there. Do we see any examples yet of the multi-tenant working or being at least tried out at this point?
That's a great question. I don't want to say like for certain because lots of people are doing lots of great things that I don't know about. For everything that I've seen and have been a part of so far is kind of single tenant specific for their operations. I do know of a number of sites that are kind of in construction and have contracts locked in. And so we'll start to see that at the end of this year, those sites go online and start to see our first multi-tenant sites. I could be wrong. There could be some out there. And if anyone knows of them, let me know. I'm very curious.
It makes me wonder if, if you band together, you have a, multi agreement and different companies coming together, is there perhaps benefits from that? Is there, you can share grants, you can share, of course, the financial load. Do you see that being able to be weighed against or to support that kind of approach?
That's a good question. I'm gonna be honest and tell you my gut reaction. And my gut reaction is like I actually think it just creates more complications than anything, because then it becomes, well, who gets the grant and is that regulation clear? Often not. Like often most incentive programs are a whole game of translation. And that's just one aspect of it, right? I mean, that's down the road of we have a site that has multiple tenants that's in the ground and operating. I think even getting there is really interesting. How many contracts do you need to make this a viable business model? Do we actually understand how those models work from a profitable business perspective yet? Probably not. How do you site a location for multiple tenants who you may or may not know who are? Do you follow the power? Do you follow the vehicle routes? Do you pick an anchor tenant and try to go close to one of their locations? Like, these are all questions that a bunch of different companies are kind of taking a slightly different approach to. And I think this year and next year we'll start to see who wins.
Hmm. Interesting. I feel like that's a case in a lot of this industry is we'll see who comes out on top next year or, what other complications are thrown in the mix and which business models stand out. And I'm starting to think about suppliers. So like, Amazon, they had a big deal with Rivian to make the EDVs, the electric delivery vans. And, there's the Ram ProMaster, there's the 40 Transits, there's all these manufacturers. But I'm wondering, typically, you're going to outsource a lot of these folks. Their business is not making vehicles. So do you see either trends with the suppliers or strategies with the suppliers that are being successful in being adopted? Is it that they need to be around for like at least a decade testing these vehicles, or are we kind of developing fast enough where companies can be convinced, okay, I'll buy yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're starting to see the first kind of EV specific commercial vehicle companies come up and out, like Mullen and Ree, which is really exciting, right? Historically, what we've seen is exactly what you said. You've got the Pro Masters, the E Transits that are basically vehicles that existed that we've put on an electric skate, and everyone kind of can trust them because they're familiar with that vehicle. What we're starting to see is companies saying, hey, we can do, I always harken back to Tesla, which is terrible, but we can do what Tesla did. We can build this from the ground up. What happens if we try to make an EV specific commercial vehicle? That is both creating really exciting advancements in technology, such as I've started to see vehicles come out with fully by wire driving, which is like new to, I'm not a truck person. So that was all like new to me and very exciting. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. And I got to ask really basic questions about trucks. That is really fascinating, right? So you're pushing things forward. What can we do with a different type of chassis? We're also seeing if that doesn't, if a supplier doesn't take a lot of time and consideration in how that chassis is going to be upfit, then we see that we've got a whole nother set of suppliers that have a new chassis that may or may not fit very well with what they're already manufacturing. So now we have downstream kind of a wave of problems, right? Which is like, oh, well, this chassis isn't exactly like a typical ICE chassis because of whatever clearance issue. And so we now have to remake this entire upfit kit. That gets pretty tricky. And I think is another place where it's like, do we have the right players in the room at the right time so we can kind of be efficient from the get-go?
Yeah, I've seen some prototypes, some concept vehicles. I think it was from Hyundai or Hyundai Kia. And it was kind of this approach of like, we can piece together all the different parts of this vehicle, on an EV platform to make it perfect for your commercial needs, whether it's a little bit longer or a little bit shorter, but it's a van or it's a truck. And I feel like it's a great concept. Would love to see it. Would love to see that be able to be adopted widespread so that it's easier to cater instead of having these case by case needs. I mean, is it just a matter of time? It does seem that having the right people in the conversation and case studies is essential with the challenges. I've heard you say a couple times, like the folks in the conversation at the beginning making, these informed decisions. Do you feel like we're moving more in that direction, or what are the ways that we can?
Yeah, I think we are moving in that direction. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do more of it. I do see more and more at conferences and events, and even just companies kind of hosting more of these forums, right, where you can try to pull in specific people. I know eSource does a really great job of this. They're a big utility partner, does a really great job of this. But one of the questions that kind of comes up is like, if you think of that model as someone's at the hub pulling all these people together, again, you get to this question of whose responsibility is that? Who is the hub, and why are they the hub? And, is that the government? Is it the utilities? Is it whoever? And I don't think that answer is solved. And what would be really great to see, I think, is some real strong pull of a true hub and a true kind of forum or think tank or whatever terms we use now, right? To really start to be pushing and driving these things forward. We see, and it took a long time, we see this in the renewable space, that specifically solar, right? That there's a number of associations that have kind of become the experts, the authority on all things solar. C is a really big one, right? And so, do we have that for the EV space yet? Nope, not really. There's a lot of questions out there to be solved. And so to see an organization like that come through where we can start to have subgroups and breakout groups and solve things and create national standards and be the experts for policymakers, OEMs, whoever, I think that's a big need in the space so far that hasn't quite been addressed.
Yeah, you're right. I feel like it's been, within different companies, their own advocate, which could definitely apply across the industry. But to have these unified forces really bringing the expertise as it's needed to the conversation and help making these decisions is important. And speaking of decisions, back to like the fleet electrification, who is making the decisions about how to electrify the fleet or how to electrify my property? Does it have to be the CEO of the company? Does it have to be the chief financial officer? Could people, even not like grassroots really, but could you have a dreamer within the company that's like, listen, there's the facts, we could do it, there's companies that help us? Who do you tend to see being those decision makers?
All of the above. It is all of the above. It could be absolutely a CEO with a vision. It can be a fleet manager with a vision. It can be, you see the fleet managers of counties and municipalities that like, this is their passion and this is what they want to do, and they're going to push it and they're going to drive it. And I think the exciting part of that is that means that any individual can be a change agent. Anyone can push this forward if they want to. I think the framework and the structure is there. The incentives to lean on are there. The technology is there. But the question is like, yeah, who gets to decide? And it's everyone. The downside to that is oftentimes when you're going in to solve these problems, maybe you have a sustainability officer at a company really pushing this and a fleet manager who's like, I don't want to do this. This is impacting my operations. So how do you align them and bridge that gap? So sometimes if, you're charging as a service provider, your work is actually in aligning a company internally, right? And making sure that their expectations on their own process are aligned.
I've heard that before in some conferences in a way where it's, I'm not education information, but it's behavior changes. It's, helping you understand the perspective and the different arguments that, yeah, it's been working the way that we're doing it, but let's get aligned on how this change is going to happen and why it's happening. Because we've been doing things for ever in a certain way, and to change it, a lot of folks are really tied to it, especially when we think like big picture of huge operations that have been running well-oiled machines, and changing those by bringing in all this new infrastructure or new vehicles, and from drivers to, the folks in charge of the charging to the fleet operators. I think there's so many experiences, kind of like you spoke about at the beginning. What are the drivers' experience when they're driving these vans around or whatever it might be, the semi trucks, hopefully one day, what are they experiencing? And it's so multi-layered. I always think of, kind of that this whole industry is a little bit of a, you're observing human behavior as well, which we won't go into too much, but it is really interesting to see how we are transitioning and how we do it best. And when you think about the further research that we do need to do in specifics, of course, there's like, yeah, we need to get range, to be a little less spooky, scary. We need for EV infrastructure to be strong, battery technology research. Is there anything that we might not be, like personally, that I might not be thinking of things we need to research or factors that we need to address that are impacting fleet electrification?
I think we really need a big emphasis on how we're going to solve temporary power. We're just going to run into this problem where we're not going to be able to upgrade a circuit for 5 years. It's just what it's going to take. So what do we do in those 5 years? There are a bunch of viable answers, ranging from we wait 5 years and we don't electrify between now and then and accept the penalties, or maybe there are no penalties or whatever, to we deploy diesel generators. I don't think either of those are the right answer. So what do we have? What is that middle ground? And I think there's some players really pushing that. some different types of hybrid generators and some temporary stuff. But I was having a great conversation with a leader at a utility recently, and sometimes I know just enough to be dangerous. And I was having this conversation. I was like, look, I don't know how utilities work, but I do know that when people build skyscrapers, there's temporary power and they'll deploy for an extended period of time temporary transformers. I've seen it happen. So if that can happen for skyscrapers, why can't it happen for EV charging installations? And this utility expert was like, that's a great idea, great point. I don't know. Let's go run that to ground. So I think temporary power is a big one that we need to be researching, and we need to start coming up with some solid solutions for, and just understanding that we're going to have to bridge the gap, and hopefully in a sustainable way. And I think the other, I don't know if it's research so much as maybe it's just waiting to find out, but I think there's a lot of question right now on like, what is truly the financial model for charging providers, not necessarily for fleet operators. I think that's clear, right? You're going to have less maintenance costs, less fuel costs, more reliability, less emissions, all these sorts of things. That's a pretty clear analysis to do. I don't know that we've figured out if you're going to be a charging provider who's not a hardware manufacturer or an end fleet owner, what does that business model look like, and how are you being successful and providing a solution? Unclear there. And I think it really comes down to like, what is the valuable asset, right? You're selling electrons. That's all we're doing. So there's obviously like a value prop there, but also you are electrifying an asset, right? And so are we actually thinking about this real estate as being upgraded and the value in that? And so long term, 10 years from now, is the ducts and the structures and all that equipment, that kind of a valuable thing? And are we thinking about that the right way? So I think the financial models of charging providers is super fascinating.
That is fascinating, thinking into the future of the value of the site with, even if it's just space where conduit could be run, like and there's a lot of regulation I've heard passing, especially with like condominiums or apartments, where you at least have to have some sort of way where you could have chargers in the parking garage or whatever it may be.
Yeah, readiness programs, right? Where you've got to kind of like run the conduit or like have it all kind of plug and play, which I think makes a lot of sense. But that would also then imply that if you own an asset and you create that upgrade, there should be some value in that, some equity in that. I personally think, and there's a lot of different opinions out there, I personally think that upgrading and those ducts and structures are going to be very valuable. And we're going to see a lot of players, take over a piece of land or charging infrastructure, put their own or different chargers on it. But for the most part, it's pretty like plug and play. We've seen it happen a little bit in Europe, actually, where people are just taking over a piece of land that's already electrified, putting whatever they want on top of it. I saw when I was spending time in Europe, a little bit more advanced. Everyone wants to be a CPO, right? So people want to white label their own equipment and have their own branded network. And so, do we end up down that route, or who knows? But I personally think that having the installed capacity there is going to be huge. I was talking to someone who works in real estate the other day, saying that we're just starting to see the impact that electrification has had to real estate. So now when you look at a listing, it might tell you about the capacity. It might tell you that there's a point of connection nearby, which indicates that this is a very important part of real estate advertising.
I mean, working in this space, I'm thinking, of course, the more, whether it's a home that has, you can charge your EV, whoever moves in there or buys it or rents it or whatever, that's valuable, to the greater magnitude of an entire property where you could put your business on there, or in the middle somewhere. It does seem like that value is going to be huge. So you could consider that as perhaps a benefit to making the investment today to not only electrify your own fleet, but if you own the property, or if you're the property owner, that you're creating something with even more value. What else could be the larger implications of that? Is it just the value of real estate, or is it going to change the way? It already is changing the way that we're building the world around us.
Yeah, I think it changes the way we build the world around us. And I think it also adds another element of who, I guess who is encouraging or facilitating adoption, right? And we already start to see some big companies, the Prologis, CBREs of the world, starting to think, hey, I've got all these assets. My customers have fleets. If I give them an asset that's electrified, I'm going to take a bet on that investment. And so we're starting to see that, and that's going to be really interesting play. So then that takes kind of some of the onus off of the fleet manager who's very busy managing their fleet. They can move into a space that is already electrified and is a little bit more plug and play for them. And does that really transition and ease adoption, right? To me, that makes more sense because I think real estate developers are a little bit more savvy as it relates to electrical infrastructure. So maybe that's where we're going to see the most success versus a fleet operator that's trying to go from the ground up and doesn't have the infrastructure. Never know.
Yeah, I think that does make a lot of sense to me. When you did bring up the temporary power, it made me think, okay, so say, I want to electrify whatever, my point of view is, and I can only get a certain amount of power. Maybe they're going to upgrade it later. Is it the decision of saying, okay, I'll put in level twos now, and if I want DC fast charging in the future, then I'll upgrade? Or would that kind of decision be made along the way?
Yeah, you can make that decision. I've worked on projects where that was done, and so it's basically we designed a site to be fully DC fast charging, knowing that we weren't going to have that power for X amount of time, and so we basically oversized all the ducts and structures and then just put little level twos on them that were on mounts that could be easily replaced in the future. So I think that's a big one. The other big one, and this isn't even based on power, I recommend this to anyone, is whatever you're doing, a lot of folks aren't fully convinced, right? You want to try it before you buy it, right? So even if, let's say, you've got a 2,000 vehicle fleet, maybe you're like, I'm going to start with 5 trucks and I'm just going to see how that goes. And if, let's say that you can't run it off L2, and so you now have to run a power upgrade or something, I would say oversize anything you're putting in. Oversize your switchgear panel. Yeah, sure, you may only need a 1,000 amp panel. Put in the largest one you can, because having those breaker spaces in the future is going to be so much easier. No one wants to cut up concrete and asphalt. I've done it so many times. Everyone hates it.
Yeah, definitely. Do your future self a favor and plan for the upgrade that is perhaps inevitably coming. Hopefully one day at least, if you're promised that, especially. But it seems like there's always something bigger coming down the line in this industry. Everything's always advancing.
Yeah, 100%. And I think for the folks that do want to kind of like try it first, right? And you only have a couple trucks. One of the other, I think you were asking, like, what are the considerations folks don't make? Big one that I think people miss a bit is, particularly if you have a facility, right? So if you're kind of got a distribution center or whatever that looks like, always check what power you have first, right? Because if you're only going to start with a couple of it, why don't you test it out on level 2? You might have a breaker out there that you can just kind of throw something in and see if it works. And hopefully that's a really, really great experience. And then we can do a much larger upgrade. But I think people sometimes forget that first step of what power do we have on site. And so they start running down a road and they're like, wow, this is really expensive and takes a lot of time. And I've got to do a power upgrade, which, like, maybe you actually don't first.
Yeah, definitely get all the information that you can, and hopefully, gather that yourself. Folks are, experts in their own business, and then also, get some help from the logistics side of things too, where folks can really help analyze it. But I think that's a good point, is you might have assets already that you could take advantage of and work with until, you want to go bigger. And when I think of grid integration, that's not, it's not a small undertaking. So to be prepared for that is of course important. But I also think of, optimizing grid interaction with an electrified property. Is it better to be, sometimes the property might not be in a good spot. The optimal property might not have the energy, or the utility can't get it there in time. Is it better to be in a densely populated area? Is it better to be, on the outskirts and the business, commercial areas? Do you see a trend in that, or is it kind of just dependent, again, case by case?
Yeah, I think it's dependent, but I also think we don't know yet. I think we're seeing both being developed. I've been surprised at some of the kind of fleet hub locations that I've seen in like really populated parts of LA. And where, as someone who has deployed a lot of infrastructure in urban areas, where my head goes is really in space layouts, right? Of, how our high volume of vehicles with high turnover are going to get in and out of this space in a safe way, particularly when you start thinking about ancillary vehicles, right? It's not just trucks, but like if the truck has to stay there for 8 hours, that person's personal vehicle has to be somewhere, and we forget that a lot. I've seen a lot of sites built without any additional parking, so you don't really know. I think that we'll have to have space constrained or highly urban solutions, because as you start thinking about operations like ports, right, you're going straight into an urban environment and you're going to be space constrained. So as most of my answers always end up in, I think it's both and all of it and everything in between.
It is always dynamic, that is for sure. We've touched a little bit on regulatory frameworks, regulation. This is always playing a part in some way or another. Can you reference the regulation? I mean, I know there's NEVI for the infrastructure bipartisan bill, of course, that is a lot of funding and plans for the future. But what regulation are we seeing in terms specifically of commercial, especially when it comes to, I know a lot of the regulation is put into place because we're thinking of clean air and, also being competitive in the global landscape of things are electrifying. Let's keep going. What regulation is coming into play here?
Yeah, this is where I'm going to get in a lot of trouble because I'm not a regulatory person and not a policy person at all. But the one we talk about,
Neither are we.
yeah, it's just not my thing. I ducks and structures. But the one we talk about the most in the commercial space is this requirement to move to 15% of your fleet being electrified by some year that I don't know what is. Should probably know. But that's the big one. And that's what everyone talks about, right? Is like, if you've got to move a fleet to 15%. And I think that is super fascinating because 15% means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And yeah, that kind of unravels, but that's as deep as like I really go in the world of policy and regulation.
Definitely. Yeah, I'll look into that and have an overlay for folks who are tuning in on YouTube. But my very quick Google search is like EVs will comprise 10 to 15% of all fleet vehicles in the US by 2030. Who knows?
Yeah.
I'll check into it. But yeah, I mean, typically we're seeing this 2030, sometimes 2035, this percent phased approach of you have to electrify no matter where you are. Of course, California has their own standards and other states have adopted those for not only light duty, but medium and heavy duty vehicles to phase in more and more electric. And of course, I mean, is the approach from most people who are electrifying their fleet saying, I got to do it, it's regulation? Or is it a balance of, I want to do this and there's cost benefits and I want to be ahead of the game, so I'm doing it?
I think it's all over the place. And I think this actually starts to talk on the point I brought up earlier, which is like, we have these big sweeping regulations, right? Like, and by nature, right? 15% by 2030, that sounds great. Let's do it. What we forget is there is a huge spectrum of use cases and capabilities to get there. So you see from the very large players, and we keep talking about them, but the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world, where they're a little self-motivated, right? And pretty much all the climate pledge members, right? Like they're pretty self-motivated. They want to get it done. The regulation helps push them, but they're moving in that direction. They also have a lot of resources, capital, people, time to do so, and a lot of data, frankly. Like they know how their operations run. We forget about a couple of other use cases that I think are really fascinating. We forget about mom and pop distribution vans. Like, what about like furniture movers who are like, they're just trying to get the job done, right? Like they may not even have one specific vendor. Maybe they're just moving stuff all around. And so is it their responsibility to electrify this fleet? Should it be all on them? And, are we burdening really small local businesses? Not that I think that's wrong necessarily, but are we thinking about it? Are we thinking about that use case and what that 15% implication means to them versus a Walmart? So I think that's a really fascinating question to start to think about. And the other use case that I think we're missing, and there are are companies that I will not name, that are very vocal about this, is that requirement becomes really challenging if you start talking about different regulations in different states and you're running a cross state operation.
Mm.
So if you think about like a large moving van company where you can rent a moving van. So if you can operate your, like, let's say 15% of your fleet in California has to be electrified, but maybe not in the rest of the nation, how does that work out? And then do you have vehicles that can't go to certain states? And like, that's complicated.
That is complicated. Everything is so complicated.
Yeah.
And yeah, with this regulation, I can imagine you're like, oh, okay, so now I have to comply, but we're an international company. So how does that come to be? And it makes me think of the emphasis of the regulation. This is obviously on your fleet needs to be electric. Are we seeing, or it makes me wonder if we are seeing a balanced approach in regulation about the properties, about electrifying. Of course, we have the public infrastructure, but what the infrastructure and the sites that will support this, is there a balanced approach? Do you know?
Not in the commercial space that I've seen. Yet again, I am not a policy regulation expert, so I might get debunked on this one really quickly. I think you see that more in the public space, right? And you see NEVI, and it starts to become about locations, right, and creating adoption in that way. You don't quite see it in commercial. What I have seen in interesting case studies, because I spent quite a few years or a couple of years in the UK, you start to see more of a push on infrastructure there, right? And that's where they're spending their time and resources and regulations and doing it in a very different approach, right? Where it's actually quite specific, right? There are already these what are called MSAs, which is basically like a glorified rest stop with lots of fun stuff in it. And those are being pushed to electrify regardless of CPO, right? Because they're saying, hey, they're already on these routes doing these things. They have to be electrified. And there's a lot of funding and regulation for that. So that's an interesting approach. I personally, as an infrastructure nerd, think that we have to push on both sides, both the fleet side and the infrastructure side. But I don't know that we know how to push on the commercial charging infrastructure side because we don't know what that looks like. There's only really a handful of high power chargers that are really, really advanced in kind of like dynamic load sharing and analytics and like really make a lot of sense for fleets. I think we're still racing to figure out what technologies are going to be most prominent, which isn't to say we can't start putting in infrastructure. It's just, I think there's a lot of questions there. We don't know where to put the power yet. So then it's hard to create a regulation.
Mm-hmm. It makes me hope that people are excited enough to take on the project at a small scale. Like we're gonna try it. It can be another case study, but I do feel like the balanced approach is what should happen. You know, if we're electrifying the fleets, we should also have regulation that encourages, you know, the proper kind of zoning regulations, the permitting processes. If you're putting in a new parking garage, even, I mean, there's parking garage that were put in my city that have like one public EV charger. And I know that's on the passenger side of things, but I'm like, y'all, there's so much potential to have a line of chargers. So if we're just, again, forward thinking, just do ourselves a favor, but also build in tremendous value to what we are building, like you were referencing before. I think that's so important. And there's a lot of business minded people that are saying, all right, it could be sold on this idea because it does make sense. And I think it stands on its own.
Yeah, there's also, like, frankly, to me, like an element of like advertising, right? Maybe not advertising is not the right word, right? But like, there's a reinforcement that there is abundant charging, right? You brought up this point earlier, which is consumer behavior change. I talk about this a lot with my friends because I'm a big nerd. Which is we forget that this industry is super nascent and we're asking a lot from a consumer behavior change perspective, not just on passenger vehicles, but also on more so on fleets. EV ownership is not super difficult, but it is different. You have to learn how to use these vehicles. You have to learn the limits. So I worked at Tesla for 6 years. I did not drive an EV, and I pushed all of this charging infrastructure. And I said, and still vehemently believe, that I, as a vehicle driver, would never own an EV without a home charger. That just wasn't something I was going to do because I find public charging to be inherently inefficient, even though I've built thousands of public chargers. And I now am an EV driver, and it's really fun to get to kind of work with my partner who's not an EV driver, but obviously has access to my EV, and talk through like, okay, well, this is how I push my vehicle so I get comfortable with range anxiety, or this is how I plan a trip and charging, and like, are we going to take my car? Are we going to take your car? Or like what that looks like. And it's not hard, but it is new. It's something different.
It's different. And a lot of people will take something different as something being hard and something that they don't want to approach. But I mean, from my point of view and from your point of view, it's like the experience and the experiment of going electric. Like, let's embrace it. Let's figure it out. Like, it doesn't have to be the end of the world,
Yeah. And if everywhere you go, every time you go to the grocery store, or every time you go to some cool restaurant and park in a public parking lot and there's chargers there, you're like, oh, like this is feasible, right? Even if it's subconscious, you're like, oh, there's charging everywhere I go. I could totally buy an EV.
Exactly. Once you kind of open up your sight to be able to be observant of this part of our world, from passenger to big scale to the chargers to the regulation, you start seeing it everywhere and seeing the significance of what's going on. So it's really cool, of course, to be in this space, and I'm so glad that we could connect and have this conversation. And I hope that we continue to have conversations, because I do think you have a great perspective. And when I think of all the different parts that are moving, I know we talked about the table, who's sitting at the table needs to be considered a bit more. We need to open it up and have openness, and we're having discussions, but make sure that basically all parties are represented at this point, because like you're saying, everything is so nascent. If we have to know kind of all the approaches, and we're not sure about much of anything yet. But I was wondering if you have seen any examples of successful collaborations between industry stakeholders or policymakers or what have you, that has led to either a meaningful change or a positive outcome, or at least a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think the biggest one is that, this was a few years ago, but, in the commercial space, I think they learned from the public charging space, and very quickly were like, okay, if we're going to start building these trucks, we need a standard connector, right? And they got the right people in the room. They had Tesla and OEMs and vehicle manufacturers and charger manufacturers, and said, okay, well, what's the truck charger? I think that was great. It was an absolutely excellent example of this. And I think a lot of the work that's being done on the regulation side has a lot of the right players in the room. Where I think we need to take those lessons learned is in a little bit more of the infrastructure side. And that is where it gets tricky, and harkens back maybe to the conversation we had earlier, which is there an EV industry association, or even specifically an electrification infrastructure association, that needs to be created and need to be addressing some of these problems? Which sounds like I just gave myself a homework assignment.
I love it. If you need some help, would love to be a part of that homework assignment.
Yes.
Yes, great. Yeah, I mean, there's so much room for innovation and collaboration and strategic approaches to find these solutions in such a new industry that has people who are passionate about it, people who are problem solvers, who have now decades worth of experience in this space to add some perspective and from different sides of the conversation. So, Taylor, I want to ask you, of course, we've talked about the challenges and the opportunities as well, but could you maybe put into words, in the whole world of electric, the number one thing that excites you about working in this space, and then the number one thing that you consider a bit more as, maybe you're a little more trepidatious about?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. I go with my gut. That's just what I will do. And I don't mean to sound like probably what everyone else sounds like, but the number one thing that really excites me is purely the impact. And I'm someone who found myself in transportation electrification, not from a passionate place. I started in renewables. I was all solar generation, renewables, portfolio standards. Like, that was kind of where I was very excited, and got into electric vehicle charging, and truly was like, I don't know if I want to charge rich dudes' cars. Frankly, I was like, I don't know if that's interesting to me. So the opportunity for impact, not only from an emissions perspective, right? Transportation is what, 47% or something crazy. Huge impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also I'm excited that we're at this tipping point where like we're far from mass adoption, but I think we can start to get there. And I think this is an industry, and most industries in America, that we have an opportunity to create a really diverse workforce, to start providing access and thinking about this from an equitable lens and enabling EV adoption through that route. And so what I'm most excited about right now is like we're bridging the gap from like this is no longer a really luxurious vehicle proposition to we can actually start serving the masses and making people's lives and experiences better through electrification. I actually really believe that, and I'm very excited about it.
I believe that too. Honestly, I think that there is, like you said, so much impact, and we didn't really even talk about renewables and renewable energies, which is something that you have experience in, and of course, it factors into the energy that we're getting, so that we can electrify properties and electrify our fleets. But maybe that's a conversation we can have another time because
Yes.
I would love to.
Yeah, that'd be
Yes.
great.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're super into that. Our audience has a lot of different perspectives, but we're always curious to understand more about how the space is developing. And of course, where the energy comes from is a huge part of it. And there's a whole other undertaking of, okay, if we're going to be electrifying everything, how are we getting the energy?
Yes. Yeah. I had that thought in the back of my head a couple times in this conversation, right? And one of the things I think we did pretty well as a country, I guess, is we started with renewable portfolio standards years ago, right? Like I was in college analyzing RPS rules and regulations, and that really enables the work that we're doing today in electrification of technology to actually be impactful, right? Because if we're not, if we're running electric vehicles off of gas power generators, like, well, that's problematic, right? Like if the coal plants are still running, like this isn't helping anything. And so, yeah, we've got to be doing both.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend and he was like, I want to go electric, but not until I'm not running it off of coal. And I see,
That's
that
fair.
point of view, and yeah, and fair, and always look into the portfolio of the state that you live in and where you're getting your energy, because who knows, you might have a lot of hydropower or whatever it is. But that is something in people's minds that we're considering: is this car still runs on something?
Yeah.
Where is it coming from?
Is it weird that it just excites me that people are making that consideration? Like people are that aware of like, I love it. That just makes me really, really happy, because I've talked to lots of utility folks or whatever, and I try to remind them, I'm like, look, most people do not care about their power bill. And I can tell you this because I don't care about mine. Like, just put me on the right tariff. Do you have time of use? I don't really care. I'm not going to look at it. And so the fact that people are starting to consider that, I'm lucky enough to have spent most of my life in the Pacific Northwest, where we have a lot of hydro and other great things. But yeah, I'm just glad people are thinking about it. That's awesome.
Agreed. There's so many conversations that are coming up, and everyday, coffee chats or at parties, whether or not, you're an infrastructure nerd like you or interested in the whole EV space, like our team. There's so much conversation to be had. And I'm really, really grateful for your time and energy coming onto the podcast today and sharing your expertise and giving me and our audience more insight into commercial fleet electrification, what the challenges are, how we're approaching them, and kind of where we stand. Because it does seem like we're in the beginning. We have a ton of potential to cater our approach using all the information we know and all the amazing people and minds we have on hand, and then carry on into the next steps.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I think now is the time. I think we have what's the phrase? The world is our oyster. And now we get to see what we're going to do with it. And I'm very excited to be
What is
part
the
of it.
pearl? Yes. Yeah. I'm excited to be a part of it too. And really, again, yeah, appreciate you coming onto the podcast so much. I hope to have some more conversations with you in the future and see you in person, hopefully at, an electric event one day or what have you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Taylor.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Francie.
Of course. And, folks are interested in learning more from you. Like, is there anything you want to put out there, roll out the red carpet for you to plug anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn and relatively accessible, so like, please reach out to me all the time. I try to be open and I don't know, friendly and whatever, all of that. So find me on LinkedIn. I am very exciting at upcoming ACT Expo, going to be a part of a startup launch that will be huge and very fun. So if you're at ACT, try to find me, and then hopefully in our next chat, maybe there'll be more channels for connection.
Oh, awesome. Yes, that's very exciting. Okay, great. Thanks for plugging that. And hopefully I'll be at ACT and can see you in person. Excited for that announcement.
Yeah, that'd be
Congrats, in advance.
great. Thank you so
Uh,
much.
of course. And thank you everyone for plugging in with us today. I know I really enjoyed the conversation with Taylor, so I hope you did too. I'm sure you all have thoughts and perhaps even questions. So please put those in the comments and share this video out and let me know what you think. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time on the next Out of Spec podcast episode. Bye bye.